I'm trying to find a proper monitor for video editing, and I was not aware of the insane amount of information someone needs to know in order to make an informed decision on choosing a monitor. So I've spent the last week researching every important spec that contributes to a monitor being great for video editing specifically. I wanted to share everything I learned in this quick video to hopefully save you some researching time. In this guide, I'll discuss some things you know and some things you probably don't know, or else why would you be here? But each of these things is important, and you should be aware of all of them, so be sure to stick around to the end. Starting out with panel type, there are 3 types that you should be aware of: TN, VA, and IPS panels. TN panels are best suited for video games because of their quick response time, so I won't even go into them, but you will see a lot of VA and IPS panels in your searches. VA panels are good because they have very good contrast ratios, which I'll go into a little more detail shortly. They usually start around 1 to 3000.
Nope, you're wrong. That's wrong. It's 3001. For the rest of this video, when I'm talking about contrast ratio, it's big number first, then small number. 3001. Sorry about that.
While most IPS monitors start at 1 to 1000. Contrast is good, and you'll even see quite a few VA panels in your best monitors for video creation lists, but their biggest drawback is they are prone to ghosting, color shifts, and motion blur, which is definitely not something you'd want in a monitor when you're creating content. IPS monitors aren't the best in every single way, but generally they have wider viewing angles and most importantly superior color accuracy and consistent reproduction. You will see far more IPS monitors being preferred for content creation because the color of your videos and photos is important. As I mentioned earlier, contrast is an important spec to look for. Contrast ratios that you will find online, like 1 to 1000, mean that on a pixel level, it can become 1000 times brighter than the dimmest pixel. The higher the contrast ratio, the darker your blacks will be and the brighter your whites will be, still being able to make out details in the highlights and the shadows. You will see sometimes monitors stating they can achieve a 1 to 1 million contrast ratio. For cheaper monitors, this is usually the dynamic contrast ratio. When a scene is changing, like in a video, the monitor can produce a better contrast ratio compared to just a static picture. However, in higher end models, these significantly better contrast ratios can be achieved statically by using screens with higher static and peak brightness, as well as using dimming technology that dims sections of the monitor to darken the shadowy part of the scenes, further increasing the ratio between the brightest and darkest pixel. Micro LED and OLED displays use these methods to achieve higher contrast ratios. 1 to 1000 is a very standard contrast ratio, with some reasonably priced monitors having up to 1300. Even some extremely expensive ISO monitors, a company that creates some of the best and most expensive reference monitors, has this $5,700 one that only has a 1 to 1500 contrast ratio. Contrast ratio segues nicely into HDR, high dynamic range. This one confused me a little bit in the beginning. At first it seemed simple, an HDR monitor that shows a lot of detail in both the shadows and the highlights. Kinda sounds like contrast ratio. However, there's a little more to it. An HDR monitor specifically is able to receive and process additional metadata about the highlight, shadow, and color detail. They will look richer, more colorful, and truer to life. But it's not quite as simple as just going about your regular use of the monitor and having everything have a higher dynamic range. First off, as a video editor, you need to be specifically shooting a video that is capturing HDR metadata. Then you need to know that the software you are using to edit supports HDR. And then finally, you need to know that you are delivering your HDR videos to screens that supports HDR. If you are a content creator for YouTube or make promotional videos for local businesses, you probably aren't doing an HDR workflow. HDR is not the norm quite yet. And unless you know you are specifically going to be creating HDR content, it may not be a feature you need right now. YouTube does support it, but I bet you haven't seen this HDR tag in the video quality settings very often. It gets even more confusing because there are a few different kinds of HDR, like HLG, Dolby Vision, and HDR10. And if your monitor is only rated for one type, it may not be able to process the metadata signal of the other type. On top of that, there are of course different levels of HDR quality. The easiest one to understand is this VESA certified HDR display that starts at HDR 400 and goes up all the way to HDR 1400. I won't go through every spec here that contributes to a higher HDR rating, but you can see it's not just about receiving additional HDR metadata. There needs to be some serious hardware in the monitor to have HDR look the best it can. Personally, because I know I won't be working in an HDR workflow, this isn't something I need in a monitor. However, from what I've read, HDR 600 is quite a bit better than 400, and obviously 1000 is better still. 1400 is actually quite a new rating, and for 1400 and 1000, you'll be hard-pressed to find it in monitors that are not several $1,000s. Something that is important to be aware of that will also dictate HDR rating is the brightness of the monitor. Most standard monitors are in the 250 to 350 nit range, also reported as candela per square meter, CD over M squared. A brightness of 400 nits is required for HDR 400, 600 nits for HDR 600, and so on. If you aren't going for an HDR monitor, 350 nits is plenty, and you'll probably still need to bring down the brightness sometimes. I have an older 250 nit monitor that I'm always shifting the brightness between 30 and 100% depending on the time of day. Also, if you looked into the HDR certificate chart, you may have seen the requirement for specific color gamuts. This is another crucial thing to be aware of. Color gamut refers to the range of colors within a specified color space or spectrum that the monitor can produce. One of the smaller color gamuts, but also the most standard that you will see in consumer-grade monitors, is sRGB, which shares a very similar spectrum as Rec 709. The other common color gamuts are DCI-P3, Adobe RGB, and Rec 2020. These gamuts are considered wide color gamuts because they cover more of the visible spectrum that humans can see. They are also almost always more expensive. When you see these specs on the listing, you will see the widest color gamut the screen is able to produce, followed by a percentage. The percentage is referring to how much of that color gamut the screen is able to produce. You want to make sure this percentage is in the high 90s. The smaller the gamut, like sRGB, the closer you want to be to 100. It's worth noting that most people consume online content on screens that are likely sRGB. In addition, if you wanted to create promotional videos for local businesses, they probably only have sRGB monitors as well. In addition, not all programs support wide gamuts, in which case colors could look oversaturated. Digital Cinema Initiatives, or DCI-P3, is the wide gamut that the film industry uses. Adobe sRGB is favored for photo prints, and Rec 2020 is one of the widest gamuts available today that you will only find in the most expensive monitors. Interestingly enough, you'd think that getting a DCI-P3 wide gamut monitor would be a great choice for a video editor. However, if you create content for YouTube, DCI-P3 isn't even supported, and colors will be reproduced incorrectly. This is the problem with a wide gamut screen. The editing you do on that screen in a wide gamut could be produced incorrectly on a smaller gamut screen. Colors will look washed out and contrast will seem poor. Similar to HDR content, unless you specifically know you will be working with a wide gamut workflow, getting an sRGB monitor with 99 or 100% coverage that has accurate color and is uniform might be a better choice right now. In the future, there's no doubt that all content will have wide gamut colors, but it's just not the case at this time. If you wanted to future-proof yourself, or do in fact know you will be shooting, editing, and delivering wide color gamut videos, most of those monitors will allow you to change the settings and select a smaller gamut in order to make sure that your video or images still look the way you have intended them to look. However, this isn't the case for every single one. Cheaper monitors that offer wide gamuts may not be able to emulate the more common sRGB color space, which is something you'd want to know and do if you want to optimize your color for the general public and the standard monitors out there. I mentioned color accuracy and screen uniformity. These are pretty important when producing any type of content. Color accuracy refers to how close the signal of color that is being received by your monitor is compared to the color that the screen is actually outputting, which is on a 0 to 100 scale and is referred to as delta E. You will see a few monitors having factory calibration, and will guarantee that the monitor will have some sort of delta E. A delta E of 5 and under is good to look out for because it's difficult to see a difference, but a delta E of under 2 has very little color variation that is imperceptible to the human eye. So that's the delta E value that professionals are going for. If the monitor is listed as having a factory calibration, you will get the calibration certificate in the box to see how accurate your specific screen is, and that's because every screen is different. If your screen is not calibrated correctly, any color correction and grading you'll be doing won't be accurate. And what's the point in spending hours on color grading and a specific look to your video when it won't end up even looking that way to others anyways? It's worth mentioning that although factory calibration is a huge plus, a monitor will lose its color accuracy over time, and it's worth investing in a colorimeter to complete your own calibrations throughout the lifespan of the monitor. Monitor uniformity is also something to look out for, which is unique to each monitor. It refers to how similar the color and brightness is of the outer edges of the monitor compared to the center of the monitor. Some companies that offer factory calibration on their monitors will include uniformity calibration in the report if the monitor supports it. There are monitors that will allow you to calibrate the color, but not all of them calibrate uniformity. Uniformity is not always discussed on a product listing either as often as color calibration is, so be sure to ask the company directly if it is not shown on the monitor listing. As far as calibration goes, there are two types, software and hardware calibration. Every monitor can be software calibrated, but hardware calibration is far superior and it is a premium feature. Software calibration is done using a calibration profile that you save on the computer, which alters the signal that is being sent to the monitor to produce accurate colors. Hardware calibration takes that same saved corrected profile, but stores it on a dedicated chip on the monitor itself. So an unaltered signal is sent to the monitor, which is then corrected in the panel before being produced on the screen. There are several benefits to this. 1. Hardware color calibrations have to be done far less often. They're just able to maintain calibration for a lot longer than software calibration. 2. When the signal has to be altered to send a calibrated signal to the monitor, it is using more data and you're actually losing some bit depth. That means your 10-bit image may actually be reproduced as 8-bit. An unaltered signal is superior over an altered one. 3. The corrected profile has to be booted every time you turn on your computer. And if you're using more than one computer with the monitor, the corrected profile has to be saved on each individual computer. While with hardware calibration, the color correction is stored on the monitor and will display correct colors right away with any number of computers. Most high-end monitors will usually have hardware calibration capabilities. Next is color bit depth. This refers to how many different shades of a color the screen can produce. On the lower end, you will have 8-bit monitors that can only produce 16.7 million colors, and more medium to high-end monitors are offering 10-bit color, which supports 1.07 billion colors, which is roughly 64 times more color information. This will dictate how smooth the transition is and will look between shades of color. 8-bit will look a lot blockier with more defined edges between gradients of color, while 10-bit will be far smoother. If you've ever seen any video in 8-bit of a sky, you will have likely seen banding, where it looks like there is actual bands of different shades of color as it goes from light to dark blue. A higher bit depth and wider amount of color support will usually be found in monitors that have wide color gamuts. But there is something specifically you need to be aware of that companies like to hide. Most monitors that aren't in the several $1,000s range that companies claim are 10-bit are actually using a technology called frame rate control, or FRC. These will usually be 8-bit monitors with 2-bit FRC support to emulate 10-bit and 1.07 billion colors. This is done by flashing two different colors to create a color that mixes of those two original ones. This technology is actually pretty good at making it look like the monitor is 10-bit, but true professional monitors use real 10-bit color. If the monitor you are looking at claims to be 8-bit and doesn't also list in brackets 8-bit and FRC, I would reach out to support to confirm with them directly. Moving on to plugs, it really is important to see what type of plugs your monitor supports and what speeds of HDMI and DisplayPort are compatible with the monitor. That's because they may not be able to support all the data you want to be sending from your computer to the monitor, such as resolution, color bit depth, and refresh rate. 4K, 10-bit color, and 60 Hz refresh rate requires a lot more data to be transferred than 1080, 8-bit, and 30 Hz. There are three types of HDMI speeds that you will see in newer monitors: HDMI 1.4, 2.0, and 2.1. An HDMI 1.4 input will only support 4K at 24 and 30 Hz, which is not high enough. In addition, it can only support 8-bit color. HDMI 2.0 is quite a bit better, being able to handle 4K 60 Hz, but it can also only do 8-bit color. This one's a little bit tricky to find because there are some sources stating that 2.0 HDMI can support 10-bit color, while others say it cannot. From the information I found, 4K 60Hz with 10-bit color requires 15.68 gigabits per second, and HDMI 2.0 can only transfer a maximum of 14.4 gigabits per second. So I'd say it's more likely than not that HDMI 2.0 can only do 4K 10-bit with a lower refresh rate than 60Hz. Then there's HDMI 2.1, which I haven't been able to find a lot of monitors with. This will probably change over time, but HDMI 2.1 can support 42.6 gigabits per second, being able to do 8K 60Hz and 4K 120Hz. It can also do dynamic and static HDR, while HDMI 2.0 only supports static HDR. If you're only finding monitors with HDMI 2.0, don't be concerned because the lower standard DisplayPort speeds are able to support a higher data rate. DisplayPort 1.2 will probably be the lowest standard you will find in monitors released in the last few years. It can support 4K 60 and even has a data rate of 17.28 gigabits per second. So it should, in theory, be able to support 4K, 60Hz, and 10-bit. However, this is another topic I kept getting conflicting answers on. You will see on several sites that DisplayPort 1.2 will not be able to support 10-bit. Regardless, 1.2 will also not be able to support any HDR. Thankfully, you will find a lot of monitors that have DisplayPort 1.4, which can do 8K, 60, 10-bit, and HDR. The newest DisplayPort standard 2.0, which I didn't find in any monitors that I was looking at, can handle up to 3 times as much data transfer as DisplayPort 1.4. So if you find a monitor that has it, you should be good to go straight to the next extreme resolution of 16K. I mentioned refresh rate, and I wanted to talk about it briefly, along with response time. These aren't things you have to worry too much about for video editing. Refresh rate refers to how many times per second an image on your screen is displayed. So 30Hz would display 30 images a second and would look and feel extremely choppy and laggy. 60Hz is the standard and what most computer users are used to. A higher refresh rate of 120, 144, or even 240 Hz is really overkill for video editing and general use. It's mostly a benefit for gaming. Same with response times, which refers to how long it takes for a pixel to go from fully active to fully inactive, white to black, and back again. Or easier way to think about it is from one color to another. For gaming, it's most optimal to get as fast as you can, such as 1 millisecond, but there isn't a lot of IPS monitors that can do this. The standard 60Hz and 5 millisecond response time you will see in a lot of IPS panels will be good enough. The last few items on the list are the easy ones, starting out with resolution. There's the old standard 1920 by 1080 Full HD, 2560 by 1440 Quad HD, and what I think should be highly considered for a video editing monitor, 4K 3840 by 2160 Ultra HD. This isn't actually 4K because it's 3840 instead of over 4000, but they call it 4K. Of course, there is also 5K 5120 by 2880, which you can find on the 27-inch iMacs, as well as some pricey standalone monitors. And then there's even a few of the big 8K 7680 by 4320 monitors starting to pop up. At this point in time, there is still a whole lot of content being shot and delivered in 1080, but 4K is becoming more of the norm. Higher resolutions over 4K becoming standard is probably a long time away off, so 4K is probably the sweet spot to invest in. Pixel density is something you've probably heard about, and it's simply a factor of your screen's resolution and size. A high pixel density is associated with a better quality image, having smoother and finer details in images and text, while a lower pixel density has less details where you can start to see the blockiness of some corners, like those weird blocky circles without fine edges. A 27-inch 4K monitor will have 163 pixels per inch, which I think is a good range to go for. If you wanted a 32-inch monitor, but could only afford a 1080 screen, you'd only get 69 pixels per inch, which I think might be a little low for video editing. 4K at 32 inches is quite a bit better with 138 pixels per inch. Okay, so this guide ended up being a lot longer than I expected it to be, but I think it sums up most of the important information and specs that you should be looking for when choosing a new monitor for video editing and content creation. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Take care. Or do in fact know you will be shooting